Kligman in UCLA, who is the host and actually the instigator of actually getting this group going together with Martha. So it's wonderful, Mark, that you're going to run the session today with your colleagues, Jeff from the Milken Foundation and Sam Adler. So I'm going to hand over to you to introduce everybody. And if everybody else can be muted, then we'll start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. Good morning, good evening to everyone. We're so glad that you're able to join us. And I really want to say a really big thanks to Geraldine for always helping to get things together, to get everything organized, to get announcements out. And it's nice that we can do this every week. And of course, to our partners in Hanover with the European Center for Jewish Music with Martha Stellmacher, thank you for all your help. And on our end with Lori Black, we're so glad that we have this wonderful cooperation to really work together. So it gives me real special pleasure today to work with one of my colleagues on the West Coast here in West Coast of the United States, Jeff Janeczko, who is the curator and chief operating officer of the Milken Archive. And we're together have the great pleasure of interviewing Sam Adler. And I thought I would start by just introducing Sam. So first, we just want to ask everyone to mute themselves so we don't have any interruptions. We'll have time later where we can ask questions, and we feel free, we invite you to open up the chat, tell us where you're from, and any questions and comments you have along the way, we'll keep track of them. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a true legend, Sam Adler, who was born in Mannheim, Germany in 1928 and came to the United States in 1939. I think we should probably start the presentation, Jeff. Do you want me to start it?
I'll do it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So for this part of the conversation, we have some nice images for you to see.
Are you seeing that, Mark?
Yeah. So we can go to the next slide. So we should start off by saying, and Sam will tell us more, that Sam is the son of a very well-known cantor and composer, Hugo Chaim Adler, who was born in Belgium. And why don't we go to the next slide? And as I said earlier, Sam was born in Mannheim and I guess played violin at a very early age, in 1936 photograph. And the next slide, in 1939, he and his father and family came to the United States. And with that, Sam has had an illustrious career. He was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters in May 2001 and inducted into the American Classical Music Hall of Fame in October 2008. He has recently received a special award from the German government, which we'll share more about that with you later. He has composed over 400 works which have been published, 5 operas, 6 symphonies, and for me to give you the full listing of everything he's done would take the entire hour. So here are just a few highlights. He's published 4 books, including a book on choral conducting, which has been republished with several editions, a book on sight singing and the study of orchestration. And at least when I was in music school in the 80s and even today, his books are the main books in music schools taught in the United States. Sam was educated at the Boston University and Harvard University and holds honorary doctorates from several other institutions. He studied composition with Herbert Fromm, Walter Piston, Randall Thompson, Paul Hindemith, Aaron Copland, and he studied conducting with Sergei Kusevitsky. He is a professor emeritus from the Eastman School of Music, where he taught from 1966 to 1995, and I met him around that period of time where he retired, but his retirement led him to the Juilliard School of Music in New York City, where while living in Ohio, he commuted and taught there for another 20 years and has also is a professor emeritus from there as well. All the while, Sam's works in Jewish music have also been significant He was music director of Temple Emmanuel in Dallas, Texas from 1953 to 1966. Recently, his works have been performed by the Berlin Philharmonic, the Cleveland Orchestra, Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, New York Philharmonic, Chicago Symphony, St. Louis Symphony, the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and several European orchestras, including the Berlin Radio Symphony. He's received commissions from the National Endowment of the Arts, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundation, the Kusevitsky Foundation, as well as many others, and has received many prizes, including in 1990 an award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Charles Ives Award. The list really goes on. A very distinguished award is in 1983, he won the Deems Taylor Award for his book, The Study of Orchestration. So we will be focusing on many of Sam's Jewish works. If you could just go to the next slide, please. We want to mention that Sam has been a very important force in the Milken Archives, and there are a number of his works that have been published in the Milken Archive. So we will be playing from those recordings as well as other recordings as well. So with all that, Sam, we want to greet you and say hello, and thank you for being with us this morning or this evening.
Pleasure to be with you, and I hope we can have a nice discussion, and I love it if people ask questions. That'll be very nice. I think you gave a huge biography. I shouldn't say anything after that, but I wanted to talk about my involvement in Jewish music, especially since that is the subject of today. As you mentioned, my father was a distinguished cantor and composer, Hugo Adler, who wrote hundreds of pieces for the synagogue. And I grew up in a house where synagogue music was the subject all the time. Furthermore, my sister and I, from our earliest days in Germany, sang in the children's choir of the Hauptsynagoge, which was the main synagogue where my father was the chief cantor. They had 4 cantors and 4 rabbis in that congregation. And you could tell by the borders of the talesim where the rabbis are and who the cantors are. The cantors had silver on their borders, and the overcantor, the first cantor, had a huge silver screen, and the others had smaller ones. The same thing with the rabbis, who had the gold on their talesim. Anyway, we had a children's choir in the synagogue. We had children's services. And you know, from 1933 on, our life revolved around the synagogue. When we came to America, my father had a very interesting experience. And I want to tell you a little about how we could get to America, because in 1939, it was already very late. Now, you put on the screen, when you had my father's picture, that he was born in Belgium. That's very true. But of course, his father, who was also a cantor, was in Belgium on a 2-year contract in which 2 of his children were born, my father and a younger brother. And it was because of his being born in Belgium that we could come to America in 1939. You see, the German quota was always filled because it had 27,000 Germans could come to America. And of course, that was filled by thousands and thousands of Jews who wanted to come. When we put in for our visa, we were put on the Belgian quota, and we were number 35, 6, 7, and 8. So we could come right away. And even though we were there during Kristallnacht, my father was put into a concentration camp only because he tried to escape to Holland, and he was caught at the border, and they put him into Sachsenhausen. By the time he came back, about 5 days or 6 days later, we were ready to go to the consulate in Stuttgart and to get our visa to come to America. So the reason we came so right away was because he was born in Belgium and we were all considered Belgian citizens under American law. This was the biggest muzzle we had. And when we came here, it was a series of miracles. Let me tell you the first one, and then I'll continue a little faster. But the first one was that we landed in New York, and some of these German families sent their oldest children to America as early as the 19th century. So my great-grandparents sent their oldest son to New York in 1900. And he worked his way up in a pants factory from being a stock boy to marrying the boss's daughter and becoming the boss of this factory. So we had very rich American relatives in 1939 when we came to America. But my aunt, who gave us, or really my great aunt, who gave us an apartment to live as long as we were in New York, said to my father right away on the first day, Hugo, you have to find a job for yourself because I can give you an apartment, but I can't support you. So on Monday, we came on a Friday. On Monday, he went to the Council of Jewish Women. And there was a rabbi there who was in charge of placing German cantors, rabbis, and teachers. And the rabbi came out. His name was Rabbi Bernstein. He came out and said, "Who are you?" And my father said, "I'm Cantor Adler. I was Oberkantor in Mannheim." He said, "Well, I like you already because every cantor that I've met from Europe, from coming from Germany, was Oberkantor at the Great Synagogue in Berlin. At least you didn't lie to me right away." So he went back in, and another miracle happened. The door opened. He had been in conference with the president of the Gemeinde, the congregation in Mannheim. Imagine. And my father and he threw their arms around each other and just wept. My father went into the office of Rabbi Bernstein and he said, "You know, Cantor, I have a job for you right away. There is a job open at Temple de Hirsch in Seattle and a cantor opening at Temple Emmanuel in Worcester, Massachusetts. My good friend, Rabbi Olin, is the rabbi in Worcester, and he's a wonderful guy. He loves music, and I think you would be a great match for him." So my father said, "Would you please put down Worcester, Massachusetts?" So he came home, and he said to my mother, "We're going to go to Worcester, Massachusetts." He said, "Where?" So he showed her Worcester. She said, "Have you been drinking? That's Worcester, like the sauce I use, Worcester sauce." "No," he said, "the rabbi said it's pronounced Worcester." Well, it took 7 months for us to finally get to Worcester. My father became the cantor at Temple Emmanuel. And that's where my career in Jewish music started because I was bar mitzvah there. And right after bar mitzvah, my father said, "Look, I need somebody to conduct the choir. So you always wanted to conduct." And I did. And so from the time I was 13, I conducted the choir of my father's synagogue. After that, Mark already told you what happened. I was lucky because while I was playing the violin, I was in my high school orchestra, which was extraordinary because we had a conductor, an excellent conductor trained at the Salzburg Mozarteum. He was an American though, and he came back and he he conducted the orchestra at my high school, which was classical high school in Worcester. And he was a pretty lazy guy. So he had me conduct every rehearsal for every concert for the 3.5 years I was in high school, and made me write a piece for the orchestra every semester. You can imagine for a high school kid, that was fantastic. And then I also, because I was quite a good violinist at that time, myself and a classmate of mine played in the Worcester Philharmonic, which was a semi-professional orchestra. And this started when I was 13. 2 years later, I was asked to write a piece for the Worcester Philharmonic, and I wrote a piece called Epilogue for the Young American Soldier. This was during the war, of course. And I have to say, between you and me, I now realize how bad the piece was, and it doesn't exist anymore. But after all, for a 15-year-old to have a piece played by a semi-professional orchestra was really something. So I got a call from a New York publisher. They were going to publish everything I write for the rest of my life. Well, of course, I needed to have a contract signed, and my father refused. Well, you can imagine. This was for the rest of my life. You just ruined my life. Well, my father was very clever. He said, look, in 2 or 3 years, when you really study composition, you'll know how bad these pieces are, and you'll thank me. And of course, I must tell you, I keep a piano piece, which this publisher, which was Mills Music, published in those days. And I keep it to see how right my father was and how bad this piece was. So now we can go on. I went to, as Mark told you, I went to Boston University. Then I went to Harvard Graduate School. And then the day I graduated from Harvard, I was drafted in the United States Army. Well, I was scared to death, but it turned out very differently. In the first place, I have to tell you the first thing that happened to me. You know, you had to get up at 4 o'clock and do calisthenics. Well, so we were stationed in Texas. I went to bed at 6 o'clock because I had to get up at 4. At 6:30, I was fast asleep. A guy wakes me up, says, Adler, the colonel wants to see you. I said, oh my God, I'm going to get taken out and shot. Well, the colonel said, Adler, I hear you're a composer. I said, yes, sir. Well, he said, tomorrow night is Christmas Eve. I want you to write a Christmas show for us. I said, sir, I'm Jewish and I know a couple of Christmas carols, but I don't know. I don't know if I could. So he asked the soldier who brought me there, he said, Boykin, tell me, do you know Christmas carols? He said, yes, sir. I said, how many do you know? Oh, he said, about 40. He says, well, you teach him to Adler and have him make a show out of it. So the next night we put on a 2-hour Christmas show. And the colonel never forgot it. And Mrs. Colonel, who really ran the show, said, Adler, you're going to form a choir because I'm a high church Episcopalian and I want a 7 o'clock service with the best Episcopal music, and you will write an anthem for every Sunday. Well, there you are. What more could happen to a composer? But we were sent overseas right away. And I was not only the choir of the conductor of the chapel choir, but I was also in the artillery, fire direction center chief. And for the next 9 months, we were stationed in a little town in Germany called Baumholder. And we had terrible relations with the town. because as you can imagine, 25,000 American troops in a town of 3,500 Germans, it was a pretty bad relationship. Well, we asked one of the people, an organist from the Catholic Church, to come up and to play for our chapel rehearsals. And she did. And after the second rehearsal, she said, you know, the French were here, they destroyed the town. The Germans were here before them, they destroyed the town. Now you're here, you destroyed the town. Couldn't you do something for us musically in the town? So we discussed it, and we started a civic choir. The first time we had only a few people. And so I went with two of our chaplains, a Catholic and a Protestant chaplain, to visit the Protestant minister of the town and the Catholic priest. The two never spoke since the 30-year war because that was still going on. We got them to talk, and we asked them to give us their choir and put together the civic choir. So we had 100 people in our chorus, and we decided to do the Messiah, because in Europe, in Germany, the Messiah is not done every Christmas. So we did it with an audience of American troops, French troops who were also stationed there, and of course, a lot of the citizens of the town. Afterwards, unbeknown to us, every major paper in Germany had an article, Buchenwald and Dresden were forgotten. It was an article about Americans and Germans getting together. Well, the American army went berserk. I had a call from our general saying, Adler, what the hell are you doing? We need to have another concert next week. I said, well, we can't do that because we don't have an orchestra. We had an orchestra for this session. So I said, how about Easter? Well, I won't tell you all the developments, but by Easter time, the American Army headquarters and Eisenhower thought this was a fantastic idea. And they sent a group of Americans to be in the orchestra for our Easter concert. And afterwards they asked me, well, what do you want to do here? I said, look, we could found an American GI orchestra to play all over the European theater. And we could make good relations between the civilian population and the Americans. The next day was the 7th day of Pesach, and I had to do services in Heidelberg. But afterwards, the general sent a car, and we got permission to found an orchestra, and that was the birth of the 7th Army Symphony Orchestra, which actually lasted for 11 years. I only conducted in the first year, but because I wanted to get out of the army, I didn't want to stay forever, and went back home and went to Dallas, and Rabbi Olin had made a pact with my parents that I should come to Dallas and be the music director of his temple, which I did afterwards, and I stayed there for 14 years. And the choir is still in existence, by the way. We had the 65th anniversary of the choir last year. And you know, I feel that was a period of the past when big choirs and sermons that were announced ahead of time made for huge Friday night services. At Temple Emmanuel, which is now, I believe, the largest Reformed congregation in the world, having 4,000 families, we had never less than 700 people for our Friday night services. And every time I went back to doing something traditional like Lewandowski or Sulzer, people came up to me at the conference afterwards, or the reception, and said, didn't you have rehearsal? Couldn't you do something new? And that was a very inspiring thing for me. And I, of course, wrote a huge amount of music for the choir and for the organ and for all other congregations that asked me. I'll stop there for a minute and maybe we should have some music. Maybe we should have.
Okay, so we'll start with your liturgical music.
Yes.
And so we'll begin with Baruch Hu. Do you want to say anything about it before we play?
Let me say, let's do Baruch Hu Shema, Micha Mocha, Ve'ahavto, up to there. Because, and by the way, this is a picture of students from the HUC and cantorial students from HUC and JPS, and recording music for the Milken Foundation, but mostly for something that was to be published by HUC. And the Baruch Hu Shema Micha Mocha are based on what we call the Adonai Malach Steiger. La 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 la, with the major third and the blues seventh, that is the lowered seventh. That is what my tradition was for the Friday night services, and all these are based on that particular motive.
Would you like me to just continue playing them, Sam, or did you want to speak about?
No, go ahead, because it's all based on the same motive.
Adonai Eloheinu
Thank you, Jeff. Let's stop here for a minute. I just want to say that the wonderful cantor on this is Rosalind Barrack, who just sings this music so beautifully. And I do want to tell you that these responses were written especially because we now have so many women cantors, and much of the music up to my time, at least, was written for either baritone or maybe tenors, more so for tenors in Orthodox and conservative congregations. Most Reformed congregations, even in Europe, had baritone cantors. So I thought some of these should be written, especially that lie well for women cantors. Now the next piece is a Hashkivenu, which is not part of these responses, but was commissioned by a congregation in Elkins Park in Philadelphia. And the cantor this time is a male cantor. And I do want to mention before we listen to it, it's Richard Barton, who now lives in California, by the way. He's retired in California, sings it beautifully. It is based on a Sephardic tune, which was originally, I guess, sung to the words of Hashkivenu. This prayer, which is usually sung like a lullaby, shouldn't be that way, because in the first place, it does mention Satan in the prayer, and it was always controversial for me. There is the building a tent of peace over us, and there is the thought that we may have bad thoughts and that they may intrude on us during the night. And in this Hashkivenu, there are all kinds of different emotions. And I feel that it's more, how should we say, on the creative level than just singing it as a hymn. So I hope you enjoy it. It's from a later period in my life, but still, I hope keeps the flavor of sacred music for our synagogues.
I realize I may have used a shorter sample there. Does that extend much further than that?
Oh, yes.
Okay, give me one moment and I can correct that.
It's on that recording, on the Milken archive recording.
I think I accidentally grabbed the clip that we had put on the website.
While Jeff is doing that, Sam, while the previous things that we heard, as you said, the responses were based on the Hashem Malach mode, do you want to maybe just say a few words about the harmonic language that you're using? Because that's always an interesting, choice in the process of writing Jewish liturgical music, is dealing with the mode and then making harmonic choices.
Well, it's, let's say, a kind of combining traditional harmony, but on a modal level, because I feel that I look at harmony from a contrapuntal point of view, and I think every piece that I write has a great deal to do with counterpoint. As you saw in the beginning of the Hashkivenu, there are different entrances, and I get my harmony from the contrapuntal ethos rather than just harmonic chords.
Thank you. We ready, Jeff?
I think so.
Okay.
Yiveinu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom ve'hamidenu malkeinu lechayim. Ve'hagein badeinu ve'haser me'aleinu ובצל כנפיך תסתירנו, כי אל שומרנו ומצילנו אתה. ופרוץ עלינו סוכת שלומך, ברוך אתה אדוני. שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל
Maybe instead of the music going on, I'm getting all kinds of questions here. Maybe we should pause for a little while to have some questions. Is that okay, Mark? Or what do you?
Sure, absolutely. So if you'd want to answer the questions you see in the chat, or I can pose them to you, whatever is best for you.
Does anybody have a question, or shall we go on?
No, let's, please. Alex Klein asked if it's based on Nusach and how it's embellished. Malcolm Miller's asking what are your strongest choral influences?
Well, if it's based on Nusach, that's a difficult question, because who's Nusach and what is it? These are based on the scales of our modal scales. The first are based on the, as I said, Adonai Malach Steiger, and the Hashkebenu starts and is based mostly on that Sephardic melody, but of course it doesn't stay that way because the text changes, and I go along with the text.
Okay, would you like to answer the question about the choral influences in your writing?
The what sources?
The influences of choral music in your liturgical works.
Well, the influence on choral music is everything, especially from Bach and Handel to Benjamin Britten, Vaughan Williams, and Aaron Copland. Those are the influences. Paul Hindemith, the Hindemith Six Chansons, for instance, had a tremendous influence on me when I was much younger. So those are the influences. And I'm glad that David Lefkowitz asked the question, since I asked him plenty of questions when he was a student of mine.
So I thought that, oh, David has a question. David, do you want to unmute yourself and feel free to ask?
Sure, I just typed it into the chat. Sam, very good to see you. Happy to see you, hale and hearty. So I'd like to ask you a more general question. How important do you feel it is for liturgical music to be in or to inhabit the traditional liturgical modes?
Well, for me, it's very important, but a lot of people have, for instance, one of the great liturgical composers of Jewish music that I value very highly is Isidor Fried, who takes as his cue a more French attitude, because he studied in Paris with Nadia Boulanger, and he was very much influenced by people like Milhaud, who comes from a French Jewish tradition, as you know, and has adopted some of the Provençal ideas into Jewish liturgical music, as for instance is in his sacred service called Service Sacre. You have a great deal of French feeling music into a Jewish setting, and that's very effective. On the other hand, there are composers who don't feel it's necessary to incorporate anything that has to do with original Jewish sources. I have written a lot of liturgical music which is not based on either the modes or nusach, because I felt that I wanted to say something. For instance, I don't think the Psalms are necessarily to be set in any kind of a mode unless you want to use the trope. That's a different story, and I've used that also. Does that answer the question?
If I could ask, I thought I heard some similarities between your Friday night settings, the Barachu and so forth, and high holiday nusach for the evening services.
No.
Is this something that's part of your tradition?
No, I don't. I wouldn't think that. I think the holiday nusach is very different from the Friday night. However, the Adonai Malach Steiger does exist in high holiday music. That's very true, because
yes,
especially in the music of Rosh Hashanah.
I'm thinking of some motivic similarities. And then going up to the 10th, and this hanging out on the dominant from the 6th above. You know, it's something you would do on every Rosh Hashanah, for example.
I think the similarities is that they're both written in the same mode. Is that
that mode is used throughout the year, as a matter of fact. I'm sorry to say that some of the modes that were sort of prohibited, like the Abba Rabba mode, comes in because in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern European tradition, it was so apparent all the time and appeared all the time that it became the Jewish mode, you know, the mode that has yada, yada.
So what I think would be good for us to do now, since we've got a lot queued up of your music, is maybe we could now move on from the liturgical music, and I'll turn things over to Jeff, who's prepared some material for you that deals with some of your art music that is based on Jewish themes. So Jeff, would you like to?
Let's hold the questions, and I'd be happy to answer.
Because I think hearing some of this additional music will be really important too. So Jeff?
Sure. Give me one moment to get my screen back into share mode again here, please. And sure, so appreciate you sharing your music as well as your many insights about these pieces, and it was wonderful to hear your biography that you opened this presentation with, so thank you for that. As we move on from looking at your sacred music to your secular music, I think we come to a point that many of us who have researched Jewish music find familiar, and that's that this line between sacred and secular is kind of porous sometimes. We can think of some examples of secular and non-Jewish melodies that have been adapted to sacred contexts. And a common way that many composers like yourself have framed secular works in a Jewish way has been to use sacred melodies and cantillation motifs as thematic material. Two of the most famous examples being Joseph Akron's Violin Concerto and Leonard Bernstein's First Symphony, which are actually based on some of the same motifs. So we're going to listen now to a movement that Sam had picked from his Fifth Symphony. So I thought, Sam, maybe before we listen, you could just speak for a moment about this practice of utilizing sacred melodies and motifs for secular music, how often you do this, how do you choose the melodies, and to what extent do you do this in your composing of secular Jewish music?
Well, I'm glad you asked that before playing this. This was written for the anniversary that we had in America. It was written in 75, but was not performed until later because it was commissioned by what is now called Union of Reform Judaism. Is that what it is? American Reform Judaism. At that time, a friend of mine, Rabbi Leonard Schoolman, was in the triumvirate, if I may say so, of the leadership of the organization. And we had been friends for a long time. And he asked me to write a large piece for the celebration. And I chose this, my Fifth Symphony, and I, at that time, was in the throes of 12-tone music. And here is a combination of traditional, or at least melodies that Jews would recognize, set against the soloist singing a 12-tone melody. So there is this conflict, and you will see it in this poem, which was written by my first wife, Carol Adler. And it's a very dynamic poem, which shows the influence of our life today and the call to our tradition. So here you have, at first, 5 instruments playing melodies that you probably will recognize as somewhat traditional, and they're not playing it in any order. That is, they're not conducted. They're just given the starting point, and then they play. Then when the voice comes in, which by the way here is Phyllis Bryn-Jolson, one of the great singers of the 20th century, and she sings the words against what you would recognize for a bar and bat mitzvah, because the orchestra plays that while she sings a very different kind of 12-tone melody.
searching for what? For we are fooling no one. There is no one to fool. Even the ghetto is a hideous dream, and the nation so long we have longed for is finally a young heifer growing into its own. Yet where have we gone, and what is our progress? We who sit here praying, not for grace but for miracles. We who call to the unknown, only to mock it when it comes. Or is the mockery only despair? The shawl we wrap around us because we must. Your echoes we say, talking to you as if you were listening. Find another place for them, another time. Put them back in their boxes, bury them, or carry them so high. We will never hear them, even when they fall. They fall from us still born. They rise before us. They rise before us like statues standing on the mountains and calling. And somebody had a question from somewhere.
Yeah, I think it was a good question to maybe address now because it ties into something that you mentioned when we were speaking last week. The question came from the composer Michael Shapiro. Wanted to know, when you mentioned that you were in the throes of writing 12-tone music, what you meant by that, You mentioned to Mark and I last week that this was kind of one of your more far out symphonic works. So maybe you could speak to a little bit to how this symphony fits in with your body of work more generally.
Okay. When I say I was in the throes of 12-tone music, there was a period in my creative life where 12-tone music played a great part. I was first influenced by very tonal music, then by Hindemithyan kind of tonality, and then slowly I got into a more chromatic phase, which led to never very strict 12-tone music. However, this melody actually is, yet the accompaniment is not. But on the other hand, I then had, I would say, from after the Fifth Symphony came the most radical piece, the Sixth Symphony. And after that, I sort of calmed down. Maybe it's age coming up. And I am writing much more tonal music in a wider sense. Still quite chromatic, but where tonality is very important in the modal sense and also in, again, I say contrapuntal sense.
Sam, it's Michael.
Yeah.
I wanted to just compliment you. These pieces are so beautifully put together and so deeply felt. Do you feel that the style is really Sam Adler using what is ever available to him? Because, you know, I think the composer makes the style at the highest level which you're at, rather than the other way around.
Absolutely. This is what I wanted to say, and I don't regret it. And I couldn't write it again. One shouldn't at any rate. But yeah. I feel that it's deeply felt and a very problematic poem, which should move all of us. And the thing is that a composer changes with time and with what he or she feels like at the moment.
About 12-tone music, I just have a question which is related also to Schoenberg.
Yeah.
I've always felt that I'm younger than you are by about 20 odd years, but I lived through that period when it was de rigueur in the academic circles, which I wasn't part of, to write a certain kind of music. It was almost a dictatorship. Yeah. Did you feel at all pressured by any of that? I don't think you would have been. Not after you've been through World War II. You would not have been pressured by academic nonsense.
No,
but I remember those days.
No, I wasn't pressured at all. But you might, as a side remark, I might tell you that for the 20 years that I taught at Juilliard, for the first 15, my closest friend was Milton Babbitt.
Milton used to tell me about your dinners. I would call him and I'd say, Milton, I want to see you for dinner. No, I can't see you. I'm having dinner with Sam Adler.
That's right.
I said, good choice.
Every Monday we had dinner, and I learned more philosophically from Milton. And musically, it was really strange that he was so complimentary about my music. That always puzzled me, but he never objected to either my writing 12-tone, because he knew these pieces, and also some other pieces that are in that style. And he said, I admire you for being a composer who writes what he wants to write.
Correct. Milton was a richtige Mensch. Love beer, by the way. Did you have beer on those Monday nights?
Great man, a great man. I learned more on those Monday nights than I had ever before.
I would think so. Sam, it's wonderful to say hello to you, and love to Emily, please.
Thank you, I will.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thanks for your question, Michael. Are there any other questions before we move on to another piece? We'll have a little bit of time at the end of the presentation.
Okay.
For some
I'd like to end with a piece that I wrote lately, a year and a half ago. It's called Gedenkfeier. And it was commissioned by a man in Frankfurt, Germany, who wanted it as a piece in a gala that would raise money to refurbish an old cemetery that was desecrated by the Nazis and is being rebuilt now. Unfortunately, because of the coronavirus, they couldn't do the gala, and they're going to do it in November of this year. But a wonderful orchestra in New York, the New York Classical Players, asked me if they could do the first performance, and I couldn't ask for a better first performance. And it is based on Lamentations, the same tune that Bernstein used in his first symphony. And it is for string orchestra, beautifully performed here under the direction of Dongmin Kim. By the way, this is from a performance in Seoul, Korea. this may be a good place to end since we're way over time.
I think so. I think it's a just a really wonderful piece of music to end on as well. Before we open up a little bit of time for some questions and answers, you shared a story with Mark and I the other day. I hoped you would share with the group about an honor you recently received from the German government.
Yes. For my 90th birthday, the German government gave me its highest civilian honor, called the Bundesverdienstkreuz. It was given to me by the German General Consul in New York with a beautiful letter from the President of Germany thanking me for making better relations between Germans and Americans and Christians and Jews, which I've tried to do all my life. And I've called my autobiography Building Bridges with Music, because I think music can build bridges between peoples, between religions, between enemies and friends by themselves, better than anything else. And I've tried to do that, and it has been my motto all my life. And I was very moved by the German government doing this for me. And I have to say that we went to Germany after that for a concert of my music in Berlin and in the city I was born in, Mannheim. And it has a thriving Jewish congregation with an excellent cantor, Amnon Selig. And they honored me by making their concert hall, or their social hall, now called the Samuel Adler Room, which moved me even more.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. We have a hand up from David Lefkowitz, and then maybe David, after your question. There were a couple of questions that have come into the chat room, so that did not get addressed yet. So maybe after your question, we can make some time for those. So if you want to, feel free to unmute yourselves when you're speaking. David Lefkowitz, please ask your question.
Sam, that was tremendously moving work. I've never heard it before, and I'm so glad I did.
Beautiful.
It seemed to me to be filled with sadness. And it occurred to me to ask you, as somebody who witnessed Kristallnacht, if you have any sort of comment or thoughts on the current state of affairs in the US and the world.
That's a horrendous question. You want to know this, what I think of the status of the world today? Is that it, David?
Well, I mean, we've seen a rise in anti-Semitic violence, a rise in anti-Semitic acts. It feels like a very different world from maybe 10 years ago.
It is. It is. But I have to say that the country that is doing more to really crush anti-Semitism more than any other country, even more than here in America, is Germany. Because what I have experienced there is very different from any other country in Europe, such as especially Poland, Hungary, France even, where anti-Semitism is really to be felt when you're there. But in Germany, they really are fighting it, which they should, as we should here. Any kind of prejudice, I feel, needs to be very badly challenged and destroyed, because we're living in a volatile world where a pandemic can ruin so many lives, and where prejudice is the greatest enemy of democracy.
Thank you.
Mark, you had some in the chat room? Or?
Yeah, were there anybody who maybe dropped a question into the chat that did not get addressed during the session? If you want to, looks like Rachel maybe has her hand up. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to when you said that you had written a lot of choral pieces specifically for women cantors, because a lot of women were becoming cantors at the time. Do you perceive any difference in writing for women's voices than when you're writing for men's voices?
No, I mean, you have to have the quality of a female voice and a male voice in your oral sense, but I feel that one has to have confidence when either one writes for male or female voice, and I love both. I don't think that one has to write differently, but one has to have the quality of the voice in one's mind when one is writing for either.
And what kind of qualities do you perceive that are different between men's and women's voices? I'm just curious.
Well, of course, each, for instance, if you write for low voice, when you write for a woman's voice in the low register, you have to know that there are certain qualities that you want in the middle register and the high register. There are different ways of looking at it. The same thing for a man's voice. Where is the strength and where is the weakness in an overall range? That is, of course, a very important thing for the composer to have in mind. The quality at each point.
Mm-hmm. Do you write for specific singers, or do you have a general sense in each vocal register of where its strengths lie?
You know, Hindemith once said to me, and I'm sure he said it to a lot of students, always write for Jascha Heifetz. You know, you always should write for the very best that you know. For instance, in my choir in Rochester, in the Rochester Singers, there was a woman, I think you will even recognize the name, Renee Fleming. And so I write for her, you see. And for male voice, you know, I write for Kaufman or the greatest. And let the singer that will sing it rise up to the occasion. I'm sorry to say I have never learned how to write easy music. But people
I suppose
say,
we'll just have to forgive you.
by easy music, I mean music that's very easily learned and therefore just recited very easily.
Thank you.
Sam, Niels Falk, who is still here, can certainly elaborate on his question, but I thought it was very intriguing. He wants to know, based on your influence with Walter Piston, who was, you discussed having lessons in counterpoint with him. You know, how has that influence maybe been a part of your work? Niels is here, and Niels, feel free to nuance that in the way you intended.
You say the influence of
Walter Piston.
Walter Piston. The influence was tremendous. He was not the very best teacher because he taught by sarcasm. And I don't think that's very good as far as a teacher is concerned. But we all learned a great deal from him. And I have to say, the early music of Leonard Bernstein is influenced much more by his work with Piston than with Copland. And so is mine. Although after studying with Copland, he was such an overwhelming influence that hopefully in my first and second symphony, it sounds as if it's a combination between the influence of Piston and the influence of Copland. I think Piston's music was tremendous influence, and I still love it. And I'm sorry to say that he isn't played more because I think he's one of our greatest composers.
Thank you. And Walter Piston is also known by the secondary dominant, which is also used in a lot in Jewish music and Gypsy music.
Theory.
And can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I mean, in secondary dominance?
The secondary dominant. For instance, if the tonic is C,
Yes.
then the secondary dominant is D.
That's right. Well, you know, Walter Piston once said to me, I'm going to quote, my last lesson with him was the only one that was personal, because he always taught in class. We were 15 in the class, and we were never private. But because I was drafted in my last week at Harvard, he said, Adler, why don't you come to my studio? And he told me he said the following things. He said, you know, Adler, I'm really worried about my music. I said, Mr. Piston, you're the most performed composer of this time. And he was. And he said, no, I'm not worried about now. But what I'm worried about is that in 25 years, people will not know my music, but will know me because I wrote a harmony and an orchestration book. And you asked the question about secondary dominance. This was the great feature of the harmony book by Piston. And he was worried about that was going to be his legacy. And you know, my orchestration book has sort of made it all over the world. And it's been translated into now 9 languages. And I'm hoping that some of my music will last past me and not only my books.
Thank you, thank you.
I don't know if that answers your question, but you know, you asked about a secondary dominant. This was a great feature of his orchestration, of his harmony book.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
I know Alex Klein had a question. You raised your hand earlier, Alex?
Was it?
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. You mentioned at the very, very beginning you were asked to compose music which wasn't Lewandowski or Sulzer or music of that style, some new music. Within the synagogue itself, I cannot understand how, within the settings of the liturgy, of the prayer, that you can actually compose new music that doesn't incorporate the rubber mode or the other modes that are used in synagogue prayer within the music. Am I right, or is this something that, you know, have I got it wrong? Put it simple as that.
Well, I think you're right in a way. Lewandowski and Sulzer invented a sound and a harmony and actually a mode, because it's very different from the original modes that you find in Edelson, for instance, because they didn't know Edelson. I mean, he wasn't born yet. They wrote music in the German, almost Protestant tradition. I mean, it's wonderful music. I love it. But when you hear something like Se'u Sha'arim of Lewandowski, well, it's a wonderful piece, but it certainly is not Nusach and has nothing to do with Jewish modes. So that they invented a new German reform language, which came to America, and you take the music of Schlesinger, who brought this music to America to a great extent. I don't think it's true that you can only write music that's based on modes for our services. And I'm sorry to say that all these modes, and even Lewandowski and Sulzer and my music and Herbert Fromm and Charlotte and my father's and so on, have been forgotten these days and are now substituted for by pop music. That certainly has nothing to do with any kind. I mean, Debbie Friedman's nice tunes, but they have nothing to do with any kind of Jewish mode.
But
I'm
if
not,
we,
I'm not talking them down. I'm just saying that that period of time is over.
but why do we have to throw away something that is not broken and look for something new when the non-Jewish world recognizes our music as classical and want to embrace it in the 21st century, where Jews want to throw it away? So I don't understand. They will save our music. Non-Jews will save Jewish music. And whereas, you know, can you imagine that happened to Bach, Beethoven, etc., or suddenly somebody saying the opera's passé, so we're not going to do Rigoletto, or we're not going to do Puccini, or something like that. It's the same with our music. It's, to me, it's classical. To non-Jews who study it at university and colleges, they think it's out of this world and embrace it, whereas Jews want to get rid of it.
I'm 100% with you. But, and I want to say, and now this is a real compliment, because I feel it very deeply, that the Milken archives have done more to perpetualize, let's do it that way, the music that was written in America for our services than any other archive or anything else. But if you ever attend services these days in, I think, both Reform and conservative congregations, you get nothing that is based on any kind of the tradition that you're talking about, the classical tradition. I'm not saying that's good, and I'm not saying that's bad, but it's a fact, and I'm very sorry about it.
Thank you.
We are living in those times, and that's what's happening. And it comes actually from the camp culture. You know, the camp culture has completely revised the music in our services.
So do you think when people embrace Karl Bach or Debbie Freeman or Spyro or people of that ilk, they're doing themselves a favor? Will that in 10 years, 20 years time, will they still be singing that? Whereas Lewandowski, Zulta, Mombach, etc. will still be around, whether they're singing it or not?
I'm not going to do any kind of procrastination about these things. I think we have to face what's happening today. Number one, there are no choirs in our congregations for the most part. Some do at Temple Manuel, New York, and maybe in San Francisco and in LA sometime. And you have Jewish choirs that still perpetuate the traditional classical Jewish music. But as a whole, our congregations do not know this music anymore. And perhaps it's time for us to do a little proselytizing. I'm for that, but you're going against the stream.
The Zamir Chorale has started to reintroduce that sort of music in their big concerts and even with their youth choirs around the world. So there may be some hope.
I hope.
Ofra? I'm sorry.
From your ears to God's ears.
Ofra, did you want to? Oh, no. Oh, I'm sorry. Michael Shapiro just wrote in an interesting note. Do you want to pose it as a question to Sam or the group?
Well, I would just want to say, Sam, you already touched on it, but it's something that I think about at 69 and you at 92, Baruch Hashem. We've worked our lives writing music, and I didn't mention Vincent Persichetti in the list. I just put down, you mentioned Piston. I think of David Diamond, Elie Siegmeister, Peter Menon, William Schumann, Mark Blitzstein, so many people. I've spoken to Jerry Schwartz, who I know has recorded for the Milken Archive, and other people, John Malcheri and other people about this, who feel very deeply about the music of the 20th century in America being basically pushed aside by all our major orchestras and minor orchestras, many of them. What are your thoughts on this, Sam? I know that you do think about this.
Well, of course, I agree with Jerry, and we've talked about it very often. Look, I think orchestras have problems. They are not run by the music directors anymore because most music directors have several orchestras and they're there to please the assembled crowd. Somebody sent me a cartoon the other day, which was very interesting. A couple was meeting in the kitchen while a lot of people were still there and they wanted them to go. And so they said, let's put on the Hindemith, which I thought was very funny because maybe when we put on Hindemith, they'll leave. I'm happy to say that Hindemith is now sort of part of the established establishment, and not enough, but some of it is. But many of us, of course, would love to have our pieces played all the time by the orchestras. And, you know, William Schumann asked American orchestras to play 10% of American music every season. Well, that's not happening, but hopefully it will happen. And maybe this revolution that we're going through now, these protests and so on, will lead American orchestras to rethink their repertoire. I'm happy to say that several orchestras have already asked me to write pieces for them, for string orchestra, because that's all they're going to have for the next foreseeable future. I hope that the pessimism, which I agree with, will somehow be alleviated in the future. Let's not forget that we are the only country that doesn't really love our own classical music. You wouldn't go to France or Germany or Italy or Russia and not hear their music.
Right.
In America, we don't even think about it. Copland, Gershwin, and Bernstein are the composers that are really done. And maybe John Adams, but he's not Jewish, so he's not done that often.
Sam, the wind ensemble world is very different.
That's right.
They do American music all the time. They want new pieces all the time.
Thank God.
Thank God for them.
Yeah, and I've just written a new piece for for the Eastman Wind Ensemble.
Yeah, it's a good.
It's a different world. Even the choral world is more experimental than the orchestral world.
Correct.
Orchestral work is bound to the budget. That's the problem.
Different than in the UK, where I work often. Thank you, Sam. This was brilliant.
Welcome.
Any other final questions for Sam?
Can I take the final question? Yes. I wanted to touch on something that you and Alex were talking about, the changes in synagogue music and what you have composed for the synagogue. It's very different from much of what is happening today. What are your goals or expectations with respect to the worshiper and the worshiper's experience?
Well, I can't really speak to that right now because worshipers now are satisfied with singing little liedlachs, you know, the same V'shamru over and over again. And that's fine because the services last just less than an hour, and that's fine. Then we have an onek and we go home. I don't think it's the same thing. I think my music, except for maybe an occasional Sim Shalom and an occasional Lecha Dodi, doesn't fit into the kind of services that I wrote for, and that is for a large choir and a cantor who loves to do new music. And maybe, Jeff, if you don't mind, and if we're through, we could end with the playing of the Sephardic Adon Olam, which would be a nice, complete ending, beautifully done by the Rutgers University Choir. And may I say that our hope, those of us who write or who have written for the classical service, is that the music is being picked up by many colleges and universities. That's where I hear my liturgical music.
Sure. Let me go ahead and cue that up. We can.
Should we end with the Adon Olam, Mark?
Yeah, sounds great.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's a great pleasure. Thank you, Mark and Jeff, for doing such a good job on keeping it going.
Thank you. Thank you. It was wonderful to share this experience with you. Mark, Geraldine, would you like to say anything before we close?
Well, thank you, Sam, for taking the time to be with us, and it was a pleasure to prepare and work with you, and just wish you all the best for all the future work and things you're doing, and we just have learned so much and are so grateful to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, all, and I hope to see you all again sometime.
We hope you'll come and see us again, Sam. It's been a real pleasure and an insight to learn about you, your history, your music, and to hear your music. So really, really grateful, and to Mark and Jeff for bringing it together with everybody. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
If I can just mention what goodies we have in store for next week. On next Tuesday, we'll be having Jerry Glantz, who is working with his father's music, Leib Glantz's music, Eli Wiesel's project, his about the death marches, and he's built that into an amazing oratorio using some of his father's voice, choir and orchestra. And Jerry will be telling us about that and talking to some of the people involved, like Dan Mutlu, cantor, Alex Taliuk from Moscow, various people who are involved, and Alex Klein will perhaps introduce that. So we'll be having that with excerpts from the Night Project next week. On the 15th of September, Yaakov Fisher from Israel, he runs the most amazing thing called the Spectacular World of Jewish Music Festival in Israel. And for the last few years, you know, I like to think, inspired by what we've done in London, he has decided that Israel is ready for listening to Jewish music. And he has made amazing concerts in all kinds of ways. And particularly now, he wants to do musical theatre. He's looking to bring the Welsh Musical Theatre Orchestra to Israel. And they're having a discussion together of, does musical theatre illuminate the Jewish experience and thereby create Jewish musical theatre? And on the 22nd of September, Zissel Schlepowitz and Stephen Naron are looking at the archive of Yale University Holocaust testimonies, taking the music from there, and Zissel is reimagining this music and developing it and writing it for a beautiful klezmer-style orchestra and recording this music. So they'll be talking to us about that project. 29th of September, we're giving you all a break. It's the day after Yom Kippur. We hope that all the holidays will go well, that people will be able to get the succor and nourishment they need from them. It's going to be a tough year. So we look forward to seeing you the next 3 weeks, and then we'll have a break. So thank you all very much for joining us. And thank you, Mark, Laurie, Martha, and especially Jeff and Sam and Mark. So
thank you, everyone.